Today we're going to talk about lifters who hyperfixate on their technique and when it becomes a detriment. So how often do you see this? Or maybe this describes you. Every time you get above a certain threshold of intensity, your technique breaks down and you have to take weight off the bar until it's perfect again. But is this the right move? There are some very popular Instagram pages that lead people to believe that they need to reduce the weight on the bar at the slightest sign of technical breakdown or they risk injury. But frankly, I disagree. And I think that if you make a habit of doing that, you're never going to see your best progress. Let's get into why. So let's start by talking about, is there a perfect technique in powerlifting? And the answer is no, not really. There are a lot of different techniques that work well for different body types, and a lot of lifters have different strategies that all lead them to success. No one size is ever going to fit all when it comes to technique. So for our purposes in this video, we should be striving for technique that is simply consistent, stable, painless, and performed to a competition standard. Everything else is secondary to that. So in general, here's where we as lifters or as coaches can assess a set we just did and see if it complies with the aforementioned criteria. Did it comply with competition standards? Was it not painful or harmful to perform? Was it stable and replicable within reason? If so, then the little technical faults and deviations we see from rep to rep probably aren't enough cause for us to pull back on our loading. The truth is, almost no two reps are exactly the same, and that's normal. Even the ones that feel the same or look nearly identical on camera still have slight deviations in bar path, bar velocity, force production, and joint angles. That's what's called movement variability, and it's a normal part of the motor learning process. It's not something we need to or even can change, and so it's not a reason to regress a lifter. A coach I very much like and respect, Mike Tuchscherer of Reactive Training Systems, has a rule of thumb called the 80% rule. Basically, if your technique is 80% perfect or better, which again is a moving target, then you don't need to regress the load in order to work on your technique. You need to focus on adding load and getting stronger. When it comes to major flaws that may be costing a lifter on the platform, it becomes a bit of a different story. One way we can address these faults is by practicing proper technique with lighter loads, as long as it's heavy enough to transfer to competition. So don't expect to do endless sets with an empty bar and for your technique to be perfect on meet day. And there, in your warm-up sets or back-off sets, your lighter work in general is where your focus on perfect technique should be the highest, because it's light enough that you can actually focus on and make meaningful changes to it. As the weight gets heavier, there will come a point where your technique becomes automatic. There's simply not time to think about it. And that's when you'll fall to the level of your preparedness. And that's all well and good, but this is also where the problem arises for people. If your technique always breaks down beyond a certain point, how are you ever going to add load to it? And when is it acceptable to let your technique break down? In truth, we have to continually expose ourselves to heavier and heavier loads if we want these skills we've been practicing to transfer when it comes time to max out. There are a lot of people who have great technique with 75% that does not hold up at 95%. And the only way you're going to improve with those heavier loads like you would be handling during a powerlifting competition is by exposing yourself to heavier and heavier intensities. And when that happens, we have to accept some degree of technique breakdown. Again, it's part of the motor learning process. It's also at this point that I should mention that for some bigger technical flaws, simply thinking about what you want to do when the bar is heavy and on your back in your competition lift is not going to be enough to fix your technique. You have to be strong enough to execute your technique. And the most effective way of doing that is very often incorporating specific accessory exercises that stress the aspect of the lift that you're trying to improve. Just as an example of this, let's say that you have a fault in your bench press where you lose your upper back tightness or your arch collapses, and that's what's costing you the lift. An accessory that you can incorporate that might remedy this issue could be something like a 3-count or a 5-count bench press. The reason being is you're specifically practicing holding your tension and your arch during the hardest part of the lift. And then when you perform the competition exercise again, we have that specific transfer of skill from that accessory. To summarize, you need to use heavy enough weights to challenge your technique when it actually matters. You can't expect every rep to be perfect, and you can't afford to go light enough all the time to ensure that they are. Let your heavy sets determine which aspects of your technique need improving. Use your lighter sets to practice that technique, and use specific accessories to improve your individual faults. And don't let little variations on your heavy sets discourage you. Well, I hope you found this useful. Be sure to follow for upcoming content. If you struggle with your technique or with progressing your lifts in general, click the link in the description to book a call with me today, where we can start to put a plan together to get you closer to your goals.